Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week has designed one of the best card games out there. If you subscribe to the idea that nature is red in both tooth and claw, then Arboretum is for you. The grandchild of people who had incredible experiences during World War II, he's also the designer of Blood of an Englishman and Cavemen, The Quest for Fire. My guest this week is Dan Cassar. Dan, welcome to the cabin.
Thanks so much for having me.
So my first question is how difficult was it for you to pick the 5 games to take to the cabin?
Probably a bit harder than it should have been. Thinking about games all the time, I have often gone through, what are the best games out there? What are these games that would, really mean something, that exemplify, the best things. And so like when I was like, okay, I need to pick 5 games that would last forever, that would, I'd take to the cabin for the end of the world. I almost had like a stock answer, right? Like D&D, Magic the Gathering, a deck of tarot cards, a chess set. And then the 5th one, I wasn't sure. And, but then, quickly I was like, oh, definitely, I would pick XCOM. But, I think we'll get to that one a bit later. But, as I thought about it, it was like, that's the responsible list. Because as I'm very much concerned with, what is a game? Games as an art form, and I like to explore all the different edges of of what a game can be, and different ways it can be a form of self-expression. And having listened to a few of your interviews, I said, that's just a bit boring. Like lots of people said Dungeons and Dragons and a deck of cards is such a stock answer. I think you had even joked about it once. How many designers take that. I mean, and it's cheating, isn't it?
Well, I to an extent, but I'm a very lax referee, so.
Well, I was going to even cheat a bit more. I was going to say a deck of tarot cards, right? Because you could use a subset of them as a standard deck of playing cards and then you could also play, various tarot games and use them for other purposes. So I felt like, I was sort of, even expanding it a bit more there. But so when I went through that list, I said, let me pick something a little more interesting. So that's why I went through and said, okay, let me choose stuff that was, very personal to me and, sort of could stand in for some of these other games, these other archetypes.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think it's that question when asked this question, are you, do you see yourself as a curator of gaming in general, or are you doing it as a sort of selfishly motivated thing for the games you love? I mean, to what degree do you think... So I guess my question is, when was the canon of board games, when did that start to be a thing? The idea of having a canon within this art form.
Yeah, it's a good question. So for me, I feel like I was born at this exact right time, so to speak, for games. I think games went through a real golden age in the late 70s or mid to late 70s. This is when you had Dungeons and Dragons first emerge. And video games really started to come into their own. You of course had, the predecessors to these things beforehand, but I don't think it was until around the time when I was born that games started to take on this new shape. I credit Dungeons and Dragons for that a lot. D&D changed our definition of what a game could be, right? It redefined, right? It has no win condition. It's extremely open-ended. It took an approach to gaming that I don't think the world had ever seen before.
And what is so we talk about art, and it's a very nebulous concept. What is art? What is craft? We talk about sort of, is Toulouse-Lautrec an artist, or was he a commercial painter? All of that sort of stuff. I mean, how do board games express themselves as art if we accept that they are?
Yeah, I'm firmly in the games as art camp. I think that as a mode of human expression, because ultimately art, I think, is about communication. It's about expressing an idea that that's hard to get at in some other way. Like when I could come over to you and say, oh, life is hard, right? Or, this experience was difficult. I could tell you that, right? But if I told you a story about it, or wrote a song about it, or did a play about it, you would experience that in a very different way. I, as an artist, could take you through that experience through this expressive medium, and it can be beautiful, right? That experience of vicariously experiencing that episode, that notion, can be a beautiful experience. And it's these things that we hold up as like, wow, this is beautiful art. And I think we get into trouble when we think of art as this separate thing, as this thing that is just, kind of curated and special and exalted above all other things. Whereas I think it's really a spectrum, right? There are many things that we can express ourselves through in all sorts of ways, and they can be artistic to greater or lesser degrees. Like, I think if you look at any great work of art, we regard it as great because it sort of hints at, some underlying truth or some, grand idea, but it is also beautiful. It is also well executed. And I think that systemic art, which is the way I've started to think about games, that's no different, right? Systems and algorithms and interaction, I think these all exist on a spectrum. I think you could look at anything systemic as a way of expressing an abstract idea, much like, I could take a painting and I could put splashes of color on it and say, oh, this represents this emotion. This is my anger. This is my fear. I think we can do many things like that, even through, through an algorithm, through an equation, or through an interactive system like a board game or a video game. I think these all, share that in common, in that they are artistic to the extent that they hint at this deeper human experience.
What does beautiful mean? When I think about a lot of the forms of art that I really enjoy, that are impactful to me, many of them are not pleasing. Many of them are challenging. Many of them can be depressing or anger-making. When you say it can be beautiful, what do you mean by that?
Right. Yeah, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? I know that's a bit cliche, but I think beauty, when talking about art in general, really is about something inspiring, something that touches us in this deeper way. It's not. I think something is beautiful when we look at it and it takes us out of ourselves for a moment, right? We're sort of captivated by it. It's something that we look at and we say, this thing in itself has value or is beautiful, just by itself, because I admire the way it is put together, or just the experience of it is so unique, perhaps.
So let's go back to the beginning then. So you have Maltese heritage. What is the story of your family's emigration to America?
Yeah, so Malta, for people who don't know, is a small country in the Mediterranean. Europeans know it, but Americans are always like, "What?" But yeah, my father was born there. Actually, my grandmother was born in America, and then left America because her family felt when she was a child. Because they felt that America was too dangerous at that time. So they left and then ended up back in Malta. And then World War II happened. And my grandmother likes to tell the story of the time when she was a new mother with my uncle in a baby carriage. And as you may or may not know, Malta was relentlessly shelled, bombed by the Axis, by the Germans, all through World War II, because they wanted to make sure that England could not use it as a base to repair and refuel their ships. So the Maltese people just went through hell during World War II. And my grandmother was strafed by a German fighter pilot, while she was had a baby, with her at the time. So just it was a very harrowing experience for her. And after World War II, my family left that country and went and emigrated to New York City and lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and then to East New York. And so my parents grew up in Brooklyn with this very blue collar sort of hard scrabble attitude. My parents hate games. They would never, and perhaps that explains a little bit about why I became a bit obsessed with them, because my father was just a hustler. He just he had very little growing up. My grandfather worked very hard. He was a machinist. And was always worked 2 jobs from what I understood, and slept literally 3 or 4 hours a night. And that sort of same work ethic, that was my father's life. I think he was telling me that one of his first real jobs was he was 15 and didn't even have a driver's license, and was doing deliveries for a jewelry company. Driving around the city at 15 years old, but he would do anything for someone who would pay him. But he actually turned that into a career. He eventually worked at he then got a job in the mailroom for that company and worked his way up and eventually became a vice president, and then moved on and now runs a business doing in the jewelry business.
So you entered the world of gaming through chess. What is that story?
Right. Yeah, so my grandfather taught me to play chess, and my grandfather would always say, "You never learn anything by winning." That was his favorite thing to say. And so he would sit me down and he taught me chess in 10 minutes, right? If you know how to play, it's very simple. There's a few pieces and, put the board. But as you know, it's a hard game to master. And so, and I was there, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. And he would just beat me again and again and again, just ruthlessly. He totally never believed in letting kids win. He said, you can only learn, you can only get better if you lose.
And when did you beat him, and how did that feel?
I never beat him. I was never able to beat him. He told me a story, actually, that he learned to play chess. I think he said from a grandmaster, although I don't believe there's very many of them. So maybe it was just like a person who was very good, a very, very good chess player. He was in the Navy and was trapped on a ship, and told me that there was nothing to do while they were at sea. So he would play chess all day with this roommate of his, and was quite a good chess player. So I don't believe I ever beat him at all. I think the longest I may have ever lasted was, 20 or 30 moves, which to me was sort of like a win.
And so what is it, do you think, about chess that keeps it so popular? Is it inherent in the game, or do you think it's a sort of societal reinforcement that this is a sign of intelligence and sophistication?
Oh, I think there's some of that going on, definitely. But to me, chess is about as perfect a game as you could want. It's incredibly simple, incredibly elegant. If somebody brought it to me as a prototype, I'd say, "Oh, this en passant thing, this is a weird extra rule. You should probably get rid of that." But but it's got a few weird extra rules. But really, it's incredibly elegant, so simple and incredibly deep. the decision space is enormous, but so easy to grok. And to me, that is something that I just think so few games are able to come anywhere close to what chess is able to do. I'd argue it even has a light dusting of theme, just enough though to get you into it, right? It doesn't feel like a war, but it certainly presents itself in a way that is warlike. I think you can take abstraction, you can move that dial up or down depending on the kind of game you want to make. But to me, chess, I think, endures because of just the incredible depth that you get out of such a small number of rules. And that's something I definitely strive for in my designs.
So D&D was such an influence on your life. Why didn't you take it to the cabin? Is it because it's been mentioned so much and you want to leave that to other people to make that decision?
Yeah, well, honestly, the reason I don't think I took D&D to the cabin is because I started playing D&D. My older brother taught me around that same age, just a bit older, I think, about 8 or 9 years old. This was the very early 80s. And my older brother is about 5 years older than me. He was learning the game from his friends. He brought it and taught it to me. And it was incredible because it really it presented this toolbox of toys to play with, so to speak. Like, for someone who's interested in games and interested in systems and is imaginative and gets into a game through a story and looks at this character sheet and goes, my goodness, this is a character quantified. This is a person, rendered in numbers and lists. Like, that just blew my mind. And I think it was when I saw D&D that I just suddenly started to understand. I think learning chess and then D&D sort of right on top of each other sort of made the foundation for, a game can range from something so simple and deep like this to something expansive like Dungeons and Dragons. And I played relentlessly throughout my entire life, really, from probably about 8 years old through college into my adulthood, and only stopped maybe, when I moved and my regular game group went away and I no longer had a group to play with regularly. So, yes, it was an enormous influence on my life. I think D&D and Magic the Gathering are by far and away the most important games made in the last 50 years. They just transformed what games could be in their respective ways. And I think that the reason I didn't include it is because I've just internalized it so much that that I could play D&D with just some dice and some papers, just talking it out. And so, to me, I don't feel like I would need that. I could just run that anytime. And so, I would want some other games that maybe I'd need the books for.
So your first game then is Seven Wonders, but you sent me Seven Wonders on Board Game Arena. Why the qualifier?
Yeah. Well, so sort of interesting about that. I love the game Seven Wonders, but I did not love it when I played it on the tabletop, which is kind of funny. I love drafting games. Drafting, I feel, is completely underutilized as a game mechanic. It's probably my favorite game mechanic because it's just so simple and yet offers so many meaty choices when it's done right. And Seven Wonders just does that just so well. But I found that when I was playing it on the tabletop, I probably played it, 3 or 4 times, and I enjoyed it, but it felt so fiddly. It felt like very hard for me to kind of, look at the chaining rules that said, okay, if you build this first, then you can build this other thing. And, you had to look back and forth at what your neighbors had. When you're playing on Board Game Arena, it just I sat down and played it on Board Game Arena, and the experience was just so smooth and so easy because it just did all of that for you. And then it just became, okay, do you want this for 3 coins, or do you want this for free? Do you want, So, yeah, and I still all the time find myself, if I have a few minutes, I can just fire it up on BGA, get a game very quickly, and run through it. I think Seven Wonders is a wonderful game, especially when it's smoothed out by a computer like that.
So I got onto BGA at the beginning of the pandemic because you couldn't see any of your friends and everyone was trying to be, constructive and do self-improvement things. And I have not stayed with it because for me, the USP of board games is sitting around a table with other people. Doesn't BGA rob analog games of the very thing that makes them special?
I wouldn't say it robs them, but I totally get what you're saying. I feel like when I play board games online now, like I will often play with my friends on BGA, and we'll have a video call going while we're playing. And so in that way, I feel like I sort of get the best of both worlds. We get the automation through BGA. We're able to get that easy play experience, but I still get the social interaction with my friends, and we're able to have a chat while we're playing. So I feel like it can. BGA does its best to facilitate that. It gives you tools to have video interactions with the fellow players. But if you're playing with strangers and you're just playing the system, yes, it's a different experience. It does not have that same social dimension that I think does make board games so special. But I think there is something. I think experiencing a board game just as its system, just as this interesting series of choices in this simplified system that you're staring at. I think that if it's a good game, if it's got good mechanics, even though you're not having some of that social interaction, you can still enjoy going through that system and enjoying it for just the mechanics of it. And some games, I think Seven Wonders is sort of like that because of the drafting nature of the interaction of it. I do feel like just running through that choice. I've played the game now hundreds of times on BGA and still can't seem to figure out the best way to play it. And I think that's the mark of a great game.
So Seven Wonders seems to me it's certainly not the first drafting game, but it's the game that made drafting an established board game mechanic. I mean, how revolutionary do you think the game is?
I think it did revolution, quote unquote, right. I think it did it. I think it took a very solid core and did it in such a way that hadn't been seen before. A game that would play this number of people, that would limit your interaction and yet feel so dependent upon what your neighbors were doing, I thought was really just sort of incredible as an achievement in game design. I don't think it's revolutionary in the way something like Dungeons and Dragons was, or even something like The Mind, right? The Mind is an incredible game, and really nothing like anything you've played before. Seven Wonders does feel like other games, but does just enough new that it was accessible, and it's still one of the few games that I can pull out when I have 6 or 7 players around a table and want a strategic experience.
So I want to move on now to your designing. So when did you start designing games?
I think just ever since I played chess. I think it was, I think that same weekend that I was visiting with my grandfather and he taught me chess, I think I came up with my own chess variant that like the very next day. Like for me, playing games and designing games were very much always a part of that experience. I always wanted to, what does this system do? Where can I explore? Well, what if it did this? Right. And so that's always been my MO. I've always wanted to, I think I decided, like, so when I first learned chess, I wanted to make my own thing. And then I started seeing, that same weekend I played Uno, and then was taught Rummy by my grandparents. And I started seeing the breadth of what was out there, and I made a promise to myself at right around that age that I would play any game I could get my hands on. And it's a promise I've kept to myself to this day. Any game that is doing something different that I've not played before, I will sit down and do my best to try to play it. So I've played a lot of different games, and I even went on a backpacking trip a bunch of years ago, back in 2009, where I backpacked through Asia. And one of my priorities on that trip was to go see what were people playing, what were the games. And I saw a lot of very interesting things. That was a really transformative experience, seeing how games were woven into all these different cultures and different people's lives. Games were very present. I was actually surprised at how easy it was to see them. Like, I remember walking through so later on in that trip, we actually went to Egypt, and I remember walking through the streets of Cairo and seeing people playing backgammon, out in front of their shops, just during the break, and in China, seeing people play these climbing games, these various versions of different climbing games, card games. Various betting games, all these traditional games in these different cultures. And you'd see some of these same games just expressed in new ways from country to country. And that was really, really interesting. So for me, anytime I get the chance to see a game played in a new way, or, something new that people play, I always want to take the chance and, have that experience.
So when we get a game in our hands and we play it, we see the designer in that sort of, for want of a better term, finished form. What we don't see is the months and years of improvement and practice that comes into getting a game good enough to be published. I mean, how long did it take you to get to the point where you thought, no, this is something that not only I will like, not only my family who are going to be nice to me will like, but people I've never met will?
Yeah, that's the trick, right? It took a while, a lifetime, really. I mean, I was obsessed. For me, I don't know what it's like for other people. I talked to lots of other designers who sort of came to it more recently, and I'm sure the experience coming to game design as an adult is quite different. For me, it's been a lifelong sort of journey. As I said, I played everything I could get my hands on ever since I was a child, and I think every skill that I learned because I was thinking, oh, this will help me make games. I learned to be a graphic artist. I actually started my career as a graphic artist because I had played with various desktop publishing software and graphics software because I was making cards and laying out D&D supplements, and how do they get that 2-column layout? Oh, why does this look funny? Oh yeah, don't use too many fonts. I learned all of these things just through trial and error, just making my own materials ever from that young age all the way through school and beyond. I think the first game that I designed to completion, though, was probably in junior high. I was probably about 13. My brother, the same brother who taught me Dungeons and Dragons, he showed me a game that I don't know that I've seen other people play, but it was sort of unusual. You take a piece of paper and you draw an X on each end of the paper at the top and at the bottom, and then you would take the pencil and you'd put it on the X, and you would put your finger on the eraser at the top of the pencil, and you would stand it up straight, and then you would kind of aim it and flick the pencil so that it would make this sort of streak towards your enemy, and that would be your move. And then you would draw a new X wherever you ended up, and then your opponent would do a move. And then whenever you decided, so the idea is you were a tank and you were shooting at each other, and you would use the pencil to slip at at your opponent, and you would try to shoot your enemy before they were able to shoot you. So I showed this to a friend of mine in 7th grade, and we would be playing in the back of the class, and then it evolved into, well, we'd have teleporters and flamethrowers and armor, and and this came from D&D, right? I have my list of spells and all the different equipment, and I think I built that into that game, and he and I were a little obsessed with that for a good year or so. So, and I think from there, like once I saw that I could make something, and it was just so gratifying to have somebody look at something you'd made and go, "Oh, that's so cool. Let me try that." Then I was hooked.
And so you've won the Cardboard Edison Award. How important do you think these design awards are?
Well, recognition is always great, right? Especially when you work hard on something, it's always nice to be recognized. I don't know if awards themselves have a ton of value, other than I think the purpose of an award is for other people to show other people and say, hey, this thing is good, or we think this is worthwhile, and it's, I think, in the best case scenario, an award should be helping the audience find games that they maybe otherwise wouldn't know about. As a designer, it's always the most important thing to me is watching people engage with something that I've made that makes them smile, that inspires their imagination. That's the most important thing. I guess the award, like something like, so the Cardboard Edison Award was for for Blood of an Englishman. And that was, I think, important in helping me get that game out to the world and getting a publisher. And so in that way, it's important. And just some recognition that maybe I'm okay at this. that felt good.
And so when you're designing, when do you know? Because I assume designing is like all creative things. The amount of false starts and stuff you end up binning way outnumbers the actual things you finish. I mean, when do you get to the point that something you're designing, you go, okay, this has legs?
Yeah, it's a little tricky, right? Because, getting, like for me, I feel like if I'm able to play the game and it's able to stay interesting for me after I've played it hundreds and hundreds of times, I play test, I think, more than any other designer I know. I relentlessly hammer at my designs. And, you were talking about like this, I was talking a little earlier about, this sort of hard scrabble, work ethic I bring to my work. I think that is very much shows up. I just have this tolerance for just hammering out a design for, again and again to try to get it to this, mirror sheen, get it to where I want it to be in my head. And I think for me, that's like, if the game is doing what I wanted it to do, if it's tickling a part of my brain that, still after 100 plays, then then I feel like I've done something that's worthwhile. For me, when I put it in front of play testers and they are talking about the trade-offs that they had to make, and they're able to they're able to talk about it in this experiential way. Like, I think that, if you finish a playtest and they're like, oh, that was good, I kind of like this part, they're not making it their own. They didn't internalize that experience. I feel like when a playtester really talks about their own experience and like they've brought some of themselves to it, that's where I feel like, okay, now I'm able to make something that people are experiencing on not that superficial level. They're really diving into this world of possibilities that I've put in front of them. And I think that's why designing games is just so fascinating to me, because in a very real sense, you get to play God for a little while, for that half hour, right? Like, I give you this little world for you to inhabit, and you get to explore these possibilities. That's why being a dungeon master is so gratifying, because people get to inhabit a space that only exists in your shared imagination, and you're guiding them through it. I think game design is very much like that.
So your next game then is Marvel Superheroes. This is an old one. Why are you taking it to the cabin?
Oh, I love Marvel Superheroes. I played that game so much. I was a big comic book nerd back in high school. Um, a big X-Men fan, New Mutants, and it actually blows my mind to see how mainstream Marvel has become. Um, Being somebody who grew up at a time where gaming was not cool, and now to see it just everywhere, I still can't wrap my head around it. It's incredible that Marvel, these characters. I mean, Moon Knight got his own TV show. I was a Moon Knight fan back in the 80s, like this was. And the notion that you would put him on the big screen, or at least a small screen, was just, it still blows my mind. The fact that these hobbies, these niches that were once relegated to geeks and basements, now everyone can participate in it. So it's kind of incredible. Marvel Superheroes in general, I loved certain aspects of that system. Their actual resolution system I wasn't a huge fan of. It was very simple. I don't know if you've ever played the game. Um, Basically, it was a percentile-based system where they had a table where you could get, green, yellow, or red results. It worked, but that's not really what I want out of that system. What I think that the number one thing I want out of Marvel Superheroes is this one book called the Ultimate Powers Book, and it truly was an attempt to catalog every single superpower that had ever been made in a comic book. And it's really an incredible achievement. If you've never seen one of these things, it's not huge, but it's a good size, it's a good sized book that has an enormous list of superpowers. And I would just have endless fun just by myself or with my friends, just going through all the powers and imagining all the different characters that you could make out of them. I think superheroes as a genre, I've played, I mean, certainly there are tons of superhero games, but I've never been happy with any of them. And one of my white whales that I've been chasing for a bit now is I want to make my own superhero game. And I think I would go back to playing Marvel Superheroes to recapture what is, just so great about that genre. I've had many false starts as to different ways of expressing why superheroes is such a cool genre and such an interesting way of telling a story. But I always, it's interesting because you want these superpowers to make a difference, but they're so hard to make sense in an abstract way. So, for example, if you're modeling Wolverine in a game, what are his powers? Well, he can heal and he has super senses and he has claws, but claws only make a difference if you're fighting and if you're modeling things on that level. Or if, Spider-Man, he can crawl up walls. Well, how is that relevant unless you're modeling something at this very granular tactical level? And then, then you're like deep in mini game kind of, miniatures game kind of territory, right? Everything becomes very, that I think is always the problem, because superheroes want to operate on this can operate on this sort of cosmic scale where they're saving the world, but then their powers are often, something that only matters if oh, okay, he can smell the guy behind that door, if that makes any sense.
And so I am not a Marvel fan, and I've gone on the record saying I'm very fatigued by the whole thing. I mean, when you have 8 movies and 5 TV shows come out every year, can you have too much of a good thing?
Oh, absolutely. You absolutely can. Honestly, so I love Marvel and I love comic books and superheroes. I don't love the Marvel movies. I will gladly say that I am, excited that these characters are getting their due, and that we have big name actors and everybody knows these characters. But yeah, I always find that the stories leave me a little cold. They're a little bombastic, a little overdone, but that's superheroes, right? But I just don't. They're not great movies that I just want to watch. Like I've seen a bunch of them, and I'm always like, oh, that was pretty good, But yes, I think you definitely can have too much of a good thing. I recently saw the New Mutants movie, which overall I thought was kind of weak, but I thought it was trying to do something different, and I wish we would have a little bit more of that.
So I want to go on now and talk about the game that you're most well known for, and this is Arboretum. So how did you come up with the idea for the game?
Yeah, Arboretum is sort of an interesting story. So I said my parents grew up in Brooklyn, and then my dad became successful and then moved out to Long Island, which is where I grew up. And just by chance, where I grew up, there was a local Arboretum right nearby. Called Bailey's Arboretum. And, I and my family would go there sometimes, on weekends or whatever. And, it was just kind of a part of my childhood. And I didn't realize that most people had never even heard of what an Arboretum is. I think Shut Up and Sit Down made a joke about it, that it was a word that a lot of people didn't know. So it was just always, the idea of an Arboretum was just something that I was very familiar with. But so I came up with the game when I had just gotten married and moved to Philadelphia, and my wife at the time, she was really fond of going to the Morris Arboretum, which is the local arboretum here in Philadelphia, much bigger than the one I grew up near. And at the time, we were playing a lot of Lost Cities by Reiner Knizia. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Yeah,
but, in my opinion, one of his best games, and just such an amazing game. And what I loved about it was that now Knizia gets a lot of, people talk about how his themes don't always marry well with his mechanics, but at least in Lost Cities, I feel like that's not true at all. I love the fact that the ascending numbers and the investment cards were just such a natural metaphor for going on this linear journey, right? Where you're going from step 1 to step 2, and you could skip a bit along the way, but you wanted to reach this ultimate goal. And I love that metaphor for having to hold back and get ready and then move forward. So I remember as we were wandering around the Arboretum once, I was like, oh, it's interesting because, in Lost Cities, you're on an expedition to find this archaeological dig, to find this site. Whereas in an Arboretum, you're moving, but you're sort of meandering. You're sort of like moving around the space. You're sort of exploring. It's less linear and more two-dimensional. And so just sort of immediately in my head, I saw, oh, well, what if I had trees with numbers and then was moving around? You would start in the middle and then work your way out. And the original hook in my mind was the idea of it growing in sort of all directions all at once.
And so the one thing about Arboretum that everyone kind of agrees on is that it's pretty mean. Was it your intention from the beginning to have that sort of disconnect between you're growing these lovely trees and yet what you're doing is really messing over the players?
Honestly, no. That was not the intention at all. I had designed the game originally for my ex-wife. She was, she had loved the Arboretum, and I was like, oh, I want to make a game, and I felt very inspired by this idea, and I was like, oh, I'm going to make a game. She'll love this, and so I started working on this, and the idea was you were going to be arranging your trees, and they look so beautiful with all the different colors. And so as I was playing it out, I'd come up relatively quickly with the idea of, having to lay out the trees, um, in the grid. Um, but then I wasn't sure exactly how they would score. And I remember, as I was playing with the cards, I got it to a form that I felt was sort of working, but the tension just wasn't there. And I remember I was playing four hands by myself, and like going, and I had the hands all laid out on the table, and I had finished the game, and everything was laid out. And I was like, just sort of staring at all the different arboretums that had been laid out by the players, and going, okay, now this one has this, and this one has this, and then I just started looking at their hands, and I was like, well, there's all these extra cards. What am I going to do with these? And it just suddenly just made sense. And once I looked at that, it all sort of came together. It felt like a tourniquet had been twisted on the game, and all of a sudden I now had to make these choices between what to play and what to hold, and it just made everything feel like it just all clicked together all at once. And that's when I knew, like, right away. And it never occurred to me that could feel mean at all. And I think this comes from this sort of I just have infinite tolerance for playing bad games, broken games. I don't mind, just hammering at it, and just and losing again and again. And for me, the idea of it being all or nothing was me clearly saying, well, in order to score this, you're really going to have to know where all the cards are. And this was me trying to incentivize you not to commit, right? Not to, and this is why the color of the path is by the start and end of it, right? Because you were starting in the middle and working your way to the outside. The idea was to, okay, you don't know what's in my hand. I'm not going to commit to this color because I don't know where it is. But once I do, then I can do the score. But a lot of people don't play it that way, and I think they stumble into this, to a position where they end up scoring nothing in it, and it can feel bad.
So this is a game that was nominated for a Golden Geek. How important is it to you that you get endorsement from the gaming public on things that you release?
Well, the point of me making a game is to entertain people, to share some part of my imagination with them. Like I said, I want them to be able to live in my world for a bit. Getting that recognition is always nice. But the most important thing, the most gratifying thing, is when people come up to me and say, I gave this, I made a version of Arboretum for my fiance as an engagement present. Or I had someone write me an email recently that said that they had played the game literally 1,000 times with a friend of theirs. And that just makes me feel that is the sort of endorsement that's the sort of thing I cherish the most, because someone is, getting enjoyment out of something that I created.
So your next game then is another small card game, and this is Matainai, and this came out the same year as Arboretum. Do the two games share any similarities?
None that I can see. That's not entirely true, right? They're both small card games, but I think that's sort of where the similarity ends. Carl Chudik's designs, I'm a huge Carl Chudik fan. I love his games. I just think he has... I think he, as a designer, does a lot of the same things that I try to do. I think he's got some core ideas that he likes to explore. I think he's been playing in the same mechanical space for several of his games that is unique to him, right? This idea of the multi-use cards and really outsized special abilities. he does this in several of his games, like Matane, like Glory to Rome, Innovation, and I think that this is very much the same design sensibility that I have. I want, now I express it a bit differently. He's, got these much more expansive types of designs. I really like a system that feels extremely tight. To me, that is really part of the artistry. I feel like with Chudik's games, and this is not a criticism, but just a difference, his feel like they're very open-ended, like they can go off in many directions and move very far. And so sometimes they just will completely, they will end very quickly, or they will, spiral, one way or another. And that's part of the experience of that game. For me, I like something that's a little more controlled, that still has that sense of dynamism, but perhaps in a more tidy package. Because for me, it goes back to that sense of minimalism and elegance that I think there's something about a card game that feels so elegant. It feels like a little world, in that little stack of cardboard, right? Because each piece of it is one aspect of that world, and then by shuffling it up and playing it out, you're watching that recombine in infinite ways, and that's just fascinating to me. And I think Chudik sees that too, and so he's doing this in this very open-ended way, whereas I feel like I'm trying to do it in a more constrained one. Incidentally, when I talk about him working in the same mechanical space, because if you look at several of his games, they kind of revisit these same themes. While I was designing Arboretum, I came up with actually an entirely new way to do it. I was like, oh, well, what if it wasn't in your hand? What if I reversed it? What if what colors were scoring was on the board, right? And then, and what was in your hand was, sort of determining this. And at that time, when I was like, oh, I could do this. Oh, wait a minute. Nope, that's a whole separate game. So I just kind of put that aside. And then finished Arboretum. And then after I had finished it, I came back to it and recently, and have been working on it ever since. It's been probably about 6 or 7 years since I started working on that, and that game is now done. And I've been shopping that around, looking for publishers.
So we were talking last night over the internet, and we got onto the subject of Chudik. And how important do you think to games as an art form are completely original thinkers like Carl Chudik?
I think you definitely need people pushing boundaries. I think like any art form, you'll want people that are taking shots at doing something completely different. Like I think I brought up the idea of games as performance art, right? There's Brenda Romero's Train came to mind, which I don't think is a great game, but it did show games doing something that games don't normally do. It showed how a game could be a medium for expressing a deeper point of, as a way to convey this more social or political sort of idea. And I think somebody like Chudik, or somebody like, even like, so Knizia does this, okay, it's your lowest score that matters, right? A lot of times I've heard other designers call it the Knizia scoring rule, right? And Chudik has this idea of, I can use this card in 6 different ways, depending on which way I choose to play it. I think each one of those ideas advances the state of the art, and we all kind of benefit as designers and players from watching these concepts get kind of reintegrated and recombined, and allowing, opening up new space for designs to head in. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Carl Chudik's work, and I hope I can do something similar by trying to push into new mechanical space. One of the reasons I try to play every game I can find is because there's always something different, always something new. If people come up with weird ideas, and you want to see how it works. And maybe it didn't work particularly well in one place, but that doesn't mean it won't work somewhere else.
And so why Matainai and not something else by Chuddock?
I feel like Matainai is for me, one of his most successful designs, because it does exactly what I feel like it wants to do, in that every card has this unique sort of game-breaking power that can completely change the texture of the game. And yet I think it's 52 cards in that deck. And so I think it does. It's a perfect example of this very small constrained package with a relatively small rule set that's impossible to teach. But I don't know if you've ever tried to teach that game.
Oh God, it's a nightmare. Yeah,
it's impossible. And why? I can't. I have often said to myself, why is this game so hard to teach? It's just because it's weird. It's so different from anything you've ever played. And I love that. I want a game that does new things, that shows me something that has never been done before. Dungeons and Dragons did that, and people couldn't get it until they were shown it. I think Magic the Gathering did that. It completely exploded the definition of a card game, right? It just opened up the whole space. You look at what a card game was before Magic and after, and it's like night and day. It completely redefined that genre. So I think Matainai basically takes that similar idea, of, okay, each card can completely change this game. And it takes that and does it in such an elegant way.
So I want to talk now about the interface between digital and analog games. So you play both video and board games. What are their similarities and what are their differences?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic. I think there is now, say the last 10 years, just way more exchange of ideas between the digital and analog worlds of games. It is now pretty typical to hear video game designers saying that they're playing the latest board games, although a little less so, I think, the other way. Although there's definitely crossover in both directions. I think that board game concepts have made their way into video games and vice versa. But I think something that video game designers often miss is that there are people playing their games. And this, as a board game designer, is something that I cannot escape from. And I think this is something that for me is just very interesting, that I love designing board games. I always thought of myself because growing up with Dungeons and Dragons, I just thought I was going to be a role-playing game designer. I worked on a role-playing game throughout all of grade school and high school, and then into college, and various RPG systems. And I love role-playing games. And what I learned through that experience was that when you're sitting at the table, your primary goal is to keep the game moving. You want it to feel fun. You want it to feel interaction. You want the system to sort of recede and become a medium for the experience. And if your system is complex, if it's too complex, it can't do that. It will stick out. You'll stumble over it. You'll have to look through the book. You'll have to, and so many role-playing games, you and I talked a bit about this, right? Like, you hear something like Critical Role and it sounds like, oh, this amazing story being told, and it feels effortless, whereas a real role-playing session doesn't go like that at all, right? You're flipping through the book, you're looking at the range for your spell, you're like, oh, can I do this? Do I have enough? There's a lot of fiddly bits. And like I said, D&D, especially in its original incarnations, was sort of simple and loose, right? It wasn't until you had the existence of a million spells and splat books and a million options, the crunchy bits that allow companies to sell supplements. These are where I think a lot of the complexities came from. And it's not that I don't think there should be these things. I love. I mean, I have an enormous collection of D&D splat books on a shelf behind me, and I love looking through all this stuff, and I think it's wonderful to spark your imagination. But ideally, I feel like a system should not be the focal point. It should be the medium that you're experiencing the game through, and the more it can recede, the better. So why this was relevant to video games is because I feel like a lot of video game designers sort of come at this, especially, people who only know video games, right, are all coming at it from this direction. This idea of complexity doesn't, just because you can do it, just because the system can bear all of this complexity, even if you can implement it, and even if it works exactly the way you want it, if I, as the player, cannot do whatever those same calculations are in my own head, then I cannot make good strategic decisions when playing your game. And I think that's something a lot of video games forget. Now, you could argue maybe you don't want people playing your game that way. Maybe you want them playing by feel. But I feel like that's a very different experience. For me, I want a game where I can grok the system, hold it in my head, and then say, okay, knowing this is how it works, what is my best decision? What's my trade-off between this turn and next turn? Or if I do this, what's going to be the longer term effects? And I think that is the fundamental, that is the biggest fundamental difference, is that, like, I love designing board games because they are so constrained. I'm a computer programmer as my day job. I co-lead a software development team during the day. And so I understand computers and technology, and really have learned a ton about data modeling and just representation of dynamic systems through doing that work. But again, if the humans using that software, if the people experiencing that system aren't able to internalize that system, then I think to some extent they're never going to really be able to inhabit that world. They're never going to be able to really immerse themselves in that experience. That's where I think board games and video games are truly different. In a board game, you don't have a choice. All of your numbers have to be small. All of your math has to be very simple. Your mechanics have to be at least somewhat intuitive. And that's why I go for these sort of minimal sets of rules. And if I'm going to put complexity in, I try to limit it to just one or two places where once you wrap your head around it, then you know it, and there it is. And the game can then let you experience it, and you can express yourself through the gameplay.
So if you look at it as a game of numbers, even from the beginning, I was looking at sort of sales dates in 1985 for Super Mario Brothers. And, it's an order of magnitude, maybe several orders of magnitude bigger than board games. Why do you think video games are just, in terms of the numbers, a much, much bigger deal?
Well, I think there's lots of reasons. I think the biggest ones are, one, because they're more immersive. A video game has music, it has video, it has graphics, it has gameplay. It can tell you an interactive story. It can approach a cinematic type experience. It can do so much more to immerse you in that world that a board game just cannot do. Yes, you can show someone pretty pictures, and yes, you can have sculpted miniatures on the table, but ultimately that requires a leap of imagination for you to imagine that those figures are actually moving around inside a dungeon, and that this little figure of this orc meeple is actually some frightening enemy, whereas a video game can render that in full glorious 3D for you, and put a dramatic score behind it. I think that's really where it comes to. Plus, there's no setup, right? Other than putting the cartridge in the console, right? Like there's no setup, there's no teardown, and you can play by yourself. That is probably the killer feature, right? Like board games, there are solo games, but I'm not much of a solo gamer myself. I hate solo testing my own designs. I have to do it for that, but I avoid it whenever possible because it's you never know what a game is going to play like until you're putting it in front of people who aren't you, because they're going to play it. No, they're going to play the rules as you've described them, and not the game that is in your head. When you're playing it by yourself, you're sometimes fooling yourself into saying, "Oh yeah, this is the decision," because you see the game as you want it to be, and not the game as you've described it. And it takes time to align those ideas. So I think that's why video games have really have always been just so much bigger than board games. But as a designer, I think designing board games is it's an incredible challenge and a great and a great way to to remember what's important, because it has to run on human hardware. It has to be simple enough for your lowest common denominator player to hold in their head and experience without you there, without you correcting things. If you have a computer doing all that for you, it's almost like cheating.
So you've entered this notion of immersion, and I've felt as immersed in a board game as I have in a video game. But I do recognise one thing, is the immersion has a different character to it. What are the different types of immersion that you get from analog and digital gaming?
Oh, definitely. I think it's a lot like the difference between reading a book and watching a movie, right? When you read a book, and if you're a reader, you know that reading the book is almost always better than watching the movie, right? Why? Because that's yours. You experienced that game, that book, that story. You filled in all those details. You have gotten to know those characters, and you've imagined them in a particular way. And then as they're evolving through the story, you're watching this drama play out, and it is extremely personal and extremely internal, and reading that story is just this amazing experience. And when you're done, you feel like you've internalized it, like you've like some delicious meal, you've consumed it, and now it's like a part of you. You've assimilated it as part of your experience. But when you watch a movie, that's not your vision. That's the director's vision, right? Hopefully it's also the writer's vision, but right, it's never going to be exact. It's always going to be some rendering of that, which may or may not work exactly for you. So I totally get that the level of immersion you get can be just as much, if not more, in an analog experience than a digital experience. But I think the key difference there is some people aren't as good at that. I think an imaginative person, which by and large game players in general, I think are a bit more imaginative than most, but not everyone can do that. Not everyone can really dive into a story and paint those pictures for themselves. They want someone to paint that picture for them. And I think video games are really good at doing that.
So your next game then is a video game, and this is XCOM. What's the appeal of this game?
Oh, XCOM is an absolute classic. I mean, if I were to choose my favorite video game of all time, it might be the original XCOM. It was the first game, and still one of the few games. I mean, there are definitely games that do this, but this was a game, and it feels very board game-like. I don't know. Have you ever played the original XCOM?
I haven't, I'm afraid.
Oh, you really should. It's such a unique experience. And the reason why is because it's very crunchy. it's got lots of. It feels very much like a board game. It's turn-based. It has tactical combat. But it is this. So the premise of XCOM is it's called XCOM UFO Defense, and the idea was you are a part of this agency that's funded by the various governments of the world to combat the threat of aliens invading the Earth, right? So you set up bases and you can send out interceptors to, as UFOs are coming in, you can shoot down the UFOs and then go investigate the crash landings. And when you play this game, you have it's very roguelike in that there is this idea of permadeath. You have your Marines, your agents with, who you'll put armor and weapons on, and then you load them up into the craft, and then you go shoot down an alien spaceship and then go try to salvage what you can from the wreckage. And sometimes the aliens survive and then will throw a grenade inside your ship and kill everyone. It was very horror themed. The music was just incredibly shrill and tense, and it was the first time I had ever played a game where I was scared. I was tense every moment because you had to make minute decisions. Okay, because every time you moved your character, if he turned, it used an action point. If you walked, it used 3. If you reloaded your gun, it took 6. It was extremely crunchy and detailed at that level, but that amped up the tension because you would have to think very hard. Okay, it's nighttime. I can't see. If I come out of my ship, there could be an alien right there ready to end. It happened almost all the time where you would have your dozen or so soldiers start coming out of the aircraft, and they just get mowed down by the aliens that are just waiting there for them. And, these are characters that you had taken on other missions that had leveled up and dead in an instant. And, just the tension that it was able to create was just delicious. It was, it's an experience that I don't know that I've had in a lot of other video games because of this mechanical realization of this world. You had to be thinking about, oh my God, where is the alien? Well, is he out there in the dark? And you were worried about it, and you were attached to these characters who were ultimately just a name, right? And but you had taken them from mission to mission. It was really just this. I had never played a game that had affected me so deeply. And the funny thing is, I played that game so much and was never able to beat it. And so that's why if it's the end of the world and I need to go to a cabin and play games and wait for the end, I'm going to beat XCOM, damn it.
So, you've clearly played this game a lot, and there has been a board game adaptation of it. What are your views on the board game version of XCOM?
I never actually played it. I've seen it played, and watched enough of it to kind of see what was going on, and it looks great. And by and large, it got pretty good reviews. But to me, the original game was looked very similar. And so I didn't feel like it was offering something so different that I needed to experience it. But I am very interested in analog digital hybrids. Being a programmer and being somebody who's very interested in video games and board games, I think this is a very fertile area that we're just starting to see different ways of utilizing apps to run board games and such. I think there is a lot of interesting design space to explore there.
I think it's great. I can highly recommend it. So I want to talk now about the future. So what do you have coming in the future that we can play?
Well, so Yeah, the last, so I put out a few games in the last bunch of years. I have not been doing a lot. I've had a lot of, personal things going on. I got divorced, I moved, and, I've been spending a lot of time raising my children. I've got 3 kids, all under the age of 12. So they keep me very, very busy. However, the last few years, I have been able to get my designs back up and running. And I've had a very, very good run the last year or two of getting my designs, moving forward again. I've got a new game that is done, and I'm shopping around to publishers. I've had a few express interest, but have not been able to seal the deal on that one. This was the game that I had conceptualized while designing Arboretum, and so it plays very much in the same mechanical space, but does so in a very different way. And the theme is also radically different. It's inspired by a Game of Thrones, and uses this idea of medieval political intrigue to show. And I use this concept of of a conspiracy to seize power from the shadows as a way of representing like the hidden agents in your hand being revealed at the end of the game when you spring your plot to seize control over the various kingdoms in play. I'm also working on a few other prototypes that some of which I can't really talk about, but I have been working with various partners trying to get some designs out the door, and I've been trying to get a more regular design and playtesting schedule in place, and it now feels like 2023 is going to be full swing for moving my designs forward.
So if you had a broad sort of ethos for game design, what would that be?
That's an interesting question. I think for me, it's, can I offer you an experience that is unique, that is unique amongst games, right? Like I feel like if I'm going to play, like one of the reasons I don't play many worker placement games, for example, is because I feel like many of them give me that same experience, like where the choices that I'm making and the feeling that it elicits and the way things work together, they end up feeling sort of similar to one another. I don't want to produce another game that works just like, it's fine to work like another game, but you want it to feel unique in amongst games in its class. And I think for me, it's about having simple, elegant rules, and that gives you an experience that you're going to want to come back to because this is something different. This is something new that I have not seen before, and I want to explore this space. I really do believe that game designers create little worlds of possibility. They do. I think all designers want to play God in that. They want to give you that world to inhabit, and if it's a world like other ones you've ever, right, then why would I visit that world when this world is bigger or better or very much the same, and I've already done that. You want to offer somebody something new, that that gives a new take on something that maybe they've seen before but never quite in that way.
And so the big question is, will there ever be expansions for Arboretum?
Well, I don't know that there will be expansions, but I do have something in the works that builds upon Arboretum, and not in the same way that for the other game that I described. It's sort of experimental at this point, but it is a new take on how to play Arboretum, but would be either playable with the original or on its own. But like I said, it's sort of an experimental space that I've been playing with, and You know, not sure how successful it'll be at this point, but so far the early tests have been promising.
So your last game then is For Sale. Is this the archetype for simplicity and depth of play?
Oh, absolutely. I love For Sale. I love any kind of auction game. I was just playing Raw last night, another one of my favorites. For Sale is just so simple and just yet so meaty. I love auctions. I love the way they work. I feel like they provide a really interactive experience at the table. I love looking at the player next to me and trying to decide what they will pay, before making my decision. For Sale is all about that. It's so constrained and so simple, and yet every time I play it, I find it surprising and really just wonderful. It's one of my favorites.
And so what is it about For Sale that makes it unique, and why would you recommend it to people to play?
I think it's because it is simply so accessible, and the two stages just play off each other so well. The different houses that you can purchase are, very charming. I love the fact that you could buy a cardboard box or a castle or a satellite. It's just silly, and so you can have fun with that part. But then those cards become fixed bids for the second round, and that's where the points come from. The interaction between those two halves of the game it's not something that I've seen a lot of, and it's executed just so well. The game just plays. It's just so playable and easy. People get it right away, and yet it's very difficult to. It can often be very difficult to decide, what is optimal in any given situation. It keeps you guessing. So, for me, I think if you're interested in auction games or very simple, how you can get really meaty gameplay out of something very simple, For Sale is about as good as it gets.
So, one more question then. So you're heading out of Philadelphia to the cabin, and you go around a corner and the back door of the car flies open. 4 of the games fly out down a ravine into a river and are swept away to posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting on the backseat of the car?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I think do I get to say that I pull MTG Arena off on my phone and I go, okay, this is good enough?
Absolutely not, no. I'm a lax referee, but you can go so far.
Well, I just in terms of one of the 5 games that I chose, it might have to be XCOM, because I don't want the end of the world to come without having beaten that game. Ben, I need to, from an emotional level, I need to beat that game. I've tried so many times and have failed. At least then I can close the chapter, and then maybe I'll just run freeform D&D for me and my kids after that. And when we get tired of that, we'll switch to superheroes. I think that'd be a fine end.
Excellent. So if people want to get hold of you, they want updates on what you're up to, how can they go about doing that?
People can always email me, dan@cassar.org. I also have a website, dancassar.com. I'm on Twitter as Maltese Falcon, but I'm not very active on social media. I'm hoping to try to get better at that. But of course, with everything going on with Twitter, who knows what's going to happen there. So at this point, I think I'm taking a wait and see attitude and see who emerges, what emerges as the final form that social media is going to take. But always go to my website. You can reach out to me on BGG or any way you like from there.
Excellent. Well, Dan Cassar, thank you very much.
Really appreciate it, Ben. Thank you.
You can support the show in many ways. You can tell your friends, you can talk about it on social media, you can talk about it in your own blog, podcast or video. You can support it directly by going to patreon.com/5G4D for a rolling donation, or for a one-off donation, hitting the PayPal link at the bottom of the website 5gamesfordoomsday.com. It's these donations that keep the show going. Also, if you want to say something nice about the show, if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on Twitter at 5gamesfordoomsday, or send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. If you want to join the Discord, you can go to 5gamesfordoomsday.com and click the link on the pinned post. And if I manage to book it from the vibrating cardboard boxes and the hand of God, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.